morning, and welcome to the Museum of the San Marone Valley's virtual speaker series. I'm Dan Dunn, the director of the museum. Last month, Duffy Jennings told us of his beat at the San Francisco Chronicle during the turbulent and sometimes awfully violent 1970s. I hope you enjoyed that program. And today, the bridge that couldn't be built. Local historian and author John Martini will tell us the story of the Golden Gate Bridge. He knows of what he speaks. He was a park ranger for 25 years, some of that time at Golden Gate National Recreation Area. Also, he is tapped by PBS and the History Channel frequently to talk about San Francisco history. Now, the bridge is a Bay Area icon. When it was first proposed in the 1910s, no suspension bridge had ever spanned such a distance, and it also had to be able to deal with rough seas, high winds, fog, and other non-bridge friendly elements. Please use the chat window at the bottom of the screen for any questions that you have. Feel free to send in any questions during this presentation at any time, and we'll address them at the end. Now it's my great pleasure to welcome in John Martini. John?
Hello. Thank you very much for the great intro. See if we get the technology to work here. Well, to introduce myself again, my name is John Martini. I'm from San Francisco and living now in Marin County on the north side of the Golden Gate Bridge. For about 20 years of my life, I crossed the bridge almost daily. And I'm happy to say that it never got to be mundane. The bridge is such a phenomenal piece of engineering and architecture. And also, it's such a spectacular visual when you cross it that it never really lost its drama. Some days it was crystal clear. The colors just popped against the green of the Presidio of San Francisco or the tawny of the Marin Hills. Other days when the fog was in, you could barely see it except maybe the tops of the towers poking through the fog coming in. About 120,000 cars cross the bridge every day. It's not just a piece of steel. It's really an icon of not only San Francisco and California, but if you will, the United States. And its story of its construction, its use, and the rebuilding that it's going through now is what we're going to be talking about in the next 45 minutes or so. There are so many nuts and bolts. I won't overwhelm you with all of them. I'll parcel out a few as we go by. But the bridge was built between 1933, opened in 1937. So it's 87 years old this year. Its birthday is May 28th, so we're coming up on it not too long ago. Of course, was there a Golden Gate before there was a bridge? Yes, there was. The Golden Gate, to go back, it's the only entrance into San Francisco Bay. It's a mile-wide strait of water. It connects San Francisco Bay with the Pacific Ocean, and it was early on seen by the Spanish and the early Americans as the key to defending San Francisco Bay. Generations of fortifications have been built in the hills overlooking the Strait of Water, making it essentially an impregnable fortress. The narrow of the water and the swift current also were a deterrent to very early ideas that, gee, we should put a bridge across this thing, to save time. Maybe kind of to get a little bit better perspective. An aerial taken about 1920, looking down on San Francisco and the straits of the Golden Gate. The Golden Gate, actually, the name goes back to even before the California Gold Rush. The Spanish, they didn't even have a name for it, aside from calling it La Boca del Puerto, the mouth of the harbor. We don't know what the Native Americans might have called it. There's one hearsay that it was called the mouth to the Sundown Sea. Okay. The name Golden Gate was christened by the explorer John Charles Fremont in 1846. and it's stuck. Mile wide. It begins at the lower right where you have the green area of that's called Fort Miley and Seal Rocks and the Cliff House, where the straits are about 2.5 miles wide, and it narrows. And it gets narrower and narrower till it's just over a mile wide at the straits. And that's where Fort Point is built. The city of San Francisco, it may as well be an island. It's at the tip of a peninsula. The peninsula is 30 miles long down to below Santa Clara. To get into San Francisco, there were fleets of ferry boats shuttling across the bay. I have a whole nother program on the origins of the city of San Francisco, but suffice it to say, it's a terrible place to build a city. Not a lot of fresh water, very little vegetation. What it had was, it had a protected harbor where you could drop an anchor, and during the gold rush, San Francisco exploded. Simply because that's the first place you could offload ships and offload passengers. By the time this photo was taken in the 1920s, the population of the city of San Francisco had gotten to be over 500,000, whereas on the left, the north side of the Golden Gate, it was only about 20,000 people in Marin County. They used to say that there were more cows than people living north of San Francisco. And it was true. The Marin County residents, everyone from ranchers to lumber people to shipbuilders, they wanted faster access into San Francisco. But so did the people in the East Bay, just off this picture, where Oakland and Berkeley are located. They were also wanted better access to San Francisco. That's where the markets were. So bridges were being considered, but the 19th century, early 20th century technologists wouldn't allow them to be built, especially across the chasm of the Golden Gate. It looks nice and placid in this view. Look, you're from the outside of the gate looking in. That's Angel Island just inside the Golden Gate and the beautiful clouds. This is a great Ansel Adams photograph taken in 1932. The calm water there, it belies the fact that the water surges through the Golden Gate at 3.5 times the flow of the Mississippi. And it's deep. There's a chasm, actually, it's been carved by eons of tides coming in and out the Golden Gate. There's a 350-foot deep chasm right in between the 2 points of the Golden Gate Straits. The earliest that I have found where someone proposed building a bridge across the Golden Gate was in the 1870s, when railroads had first reached California. And it was proposed by a guy named Charlie Crocker to build a wooden bridge across the Golden Gate. But soundings realized that there was just no way you could build a wooden trestle bridge across an opening that big. Things really didn't get going until the 1910s. In 1916, the city of San Francisco's chief engineer asked for proposals to build a bridge across the Golden Gate, essentially saying, let's get this thing off dead center. Can it be done? Let's get some proposals in here. The 1919, the first solid proposals started to come in. Now, as I mentioned, there were ways to get across the Golden Gate. The primary one was ferry boats. There were dozens and dozens of ferry boats shuttling between San Francisco and Marin, and San Francisco and Oakland, Berkeley, and they were all owned by railroad companies. And railroad companies were the big monopoly in California in the 1910s and 20s and 30s. And boy, they did not want to give up on the ferry routes. They immediately started to oppose the idea of putting a bridge across the Golden Gate. This saga would continue for years because putting a bridge across would mean that they would lose traffic. People that wanted the bridge built, they were tired of having to use a ferry schedule to move goods and people across the Golden Gate. And the ferries could essentially charge whatever they wanted. A bridge would give competition. This is the guy that came up with the first practical idea for spanning the Golden Gate. Joseph Strauss. He was a well-known engineer. He was in his 50s, and he was a visionary. One of his graduate projects had been he designed a theoretical bridge across the Bering Strait to connect Asia and Alaska. he saw bridging the Golden Gate as one of the supreme challenges, but one that could actually be done. And he got together a group of people that formed a Golden Gate Bridge district to lobby for the construction of a Golden Gate Bridge. Many, many challenges had to be met. First off, there was a lot of opposition from the ferry company. The Golden Gate Straits, their military land on both sides, the Presidio on one side, Fort Baker on the other. They'd have to get the permission of the Army through Congress to build the thing. They'd have to overcome conflicting geology reports about could the land support a bridge. All these things Strauss would overcome. The biggest problem he had building the Golden Gate Bridge was getting permission to build it, working his way through all the permittees, all the opposition. The one problem that he really ran into is who's going to pay for the thing. It would normally be something that the government would pay for. California, the state of California would pay for it. Well, the state was already committed to building a bridge to Oakland, what would become the San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge. Strauss and the Bridge District, they formed a bond district where the people of San Francisco and Marin and 5 other counties essentially put up their own real estate as collateral to sell bonds to construct the Golden Gate Bridge. Strauss went on like a barnstorming tour talking to church groups and Kiwanis and everybody else to sell the idea of voting in to create the bond district, to sell bonds to raise the money. It was anticipated to be over $30 million to build the Golden Gate Bridge. And he also gathered with himself a number of other architects and engineers, sort of a dream team. It was just too much for one man to design on his own. So he brought in fellows by the name of Charles Ellis, who ran the never-ending numbers, the advanced math it took to build a bridge like this. John Eberson, architect, Irving Morrow, another architect, Clifford Payne, and others. I'm glad he did, because Strauss was very nuts and bolts. He had built hundreds of bridges around the country, and this is the type of bridge that he built. This one still exists in San Francisco. It's called the Lefty O'Doul Bridge, or the 3rd Street Lift Bridge. And it's a counterbalance bridge to open and close to allow ships through. And it looks like something you build, like a kid would build with an erector set. It's very straightforward. It does what it does, but there's not a lot of delicacy or elegance to it. And kind of reflecting this idea, this was the original 1921 proposal that Strauss put forward to build a bridge across the Golden Gate. He knew it was such a long distance, in fact, no one had ever bridged a distance this far before, that it couldn't be just a rigid girder bridge, a cantilever bridge. It would have to be, at least partly, suspension bridge. So he ended up with this proposal, which critics immediately pounced on. My favorite contrary comment was somebody called it an upside down rat trap. The Army didn't like it. The Navy didn't like it. The Navy was afraid battleships would run into it. The Army was afraid that a bomb just at the right location would drop the whole contraption into the Golden Gate. So there was a lot of fiddling that went on with both engineering and also with ideas and proposals. And finally, the Irving Morrow, the architect, working with the others, they came up with this concept. And this is what finally got people to accept the concept of a bridge across the Golden Gate. This was his 1930 proposal. It's no longer cantilever. It's a pure suspension bridge. It was going to be longer than any suspension bridge had ever been before, but they figured that it could be done. And with this moving forward, eventually a bridge district was formed, bonds were let. One thing they had to overcome was there were 1,200 lawsuits by various groups opposing the Golden Gate Bridge, starting with the ferry companies. There were also concerned citizens groups, including the Sierra Club, who said that a bridge across the Golden Gate would destroy its beauty. There were other groups who contended that it was going to be a hazard because one geologist said it was going to sit on pudding stone. You get conflicting geologists. That delayed matters. Finally, the powers that be, the Corps of Engineers, the city engineer of San Francisco, the California Department of Highways, all the permissions were granted and work would begin. Now, I got to explain what a suspension bridge is. I originally designed this program for kids groups. And I said, let's use a touchstone that maybe kids can relate to. And that's this scene from the movie Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, where they cross a suspension bridge and Indiana Jones is caught halfway on the suspension bridge. This has all the same elements that a suspension bridge like the Golden Gate Bridge has. Another perspective looking down. In the foreground, there are two stone columns. These are towers. And stretched between the towers, you can see there's another pair on the far side. There's a big heavy cable. And that cable is supporting the walkway that Indiana Jones is about to have a sword fight on. The two thick cables closest to us, stretching away from the tower, those are attached to anchors set into the ground. Here's another sketch of how a bridge actually works. In this sort of cartoon drawing, the two tall verticals, those are the towers, the grown-up version of the ones in the Indiana Jones image. The red, those are the big cables that hold the bridge deck. The bridge deck is the blue-green going across the bottom. Now, a deck on a suspension bridge can either be just wide enough for a person to walk across, or it can be wide enough for 6 lanes of traffic. And at the very far end, you can see the giant blue block. That's a big hunk of concrete buried into the ground that actually supports the weight of the bridge. The cables are holding the bridge deck in place, but the whole thing's going to collapse unless the far ends of those cables are attached to something that isn't going to move. And when you apply it to the Golden Gate Bridge, the towers are 4,200 feet apart. The concrete blocks at either end, the bridge deck with its very slight arch, and the big cables, and then the little slender vertical ones. Those are called suspender ropes. We're going to get into each one of those as we go along. I call your attention to the tower on the left. Earlier, I'd said there is a 350-foot deep trench under the Golden Gate Bridge. Yeah, it's right about middle span of the bridge, just to the right of the sailboat there. It's 350 feet deep. One of the big challenges was building the tower on the left, what's called the San Francisco Tower. It's actually in the open ocean. The water there is about 100 feet deep. But just to the right of where the tower is, the chasm starts. That's as far to the north into the open ocean as they could build the tower and still be able to put its footings on the bottom. Any further than that, and it would have been impossibly, insanely deep to build the bridge. Construction finally got underway in February of 1933. I had to show these because there's the chief engineer and there's the mayor of San Francisco, and they're shoveling dirt. And this was all for the cameras. The real work had started a month before on constructing massive excavations, both in San Francisco and Marin, to build the footings for the anchors of the Golden Gate Bridge. The massive blocks that would be the place where the cables tied off and that would hold the future bridge in place. And these holes in the ground were just immense. They went down about 80 feet. This is on the San Francisco side. If you look closely towards the bottom, you can see there's a series of parallel lines. Those are actually giant carved serrated teeth that were chiseled into the natural rock. And when the concrete work is poured into that hole, the concrete is going to mesh with the teeth, and the whole weight of the bridge is going to be pulling against the concrete block, and it's also going to be pulling against the earth itself. The bridge is well anchored. View of the concrete anchorages being built, this time on the Marin side. I'll give you an idea of the scale of those two blocks that you're looking at. This is the ironwork that is going to be encased in solid concrete and the red arrow shows the size of a workman. Each of these anchors, and they were identical, just mirror images of each other, they were steel I-beams, steel girder construction, 60,000 pounds or 60,000 tons of concrete were used to encase the entire girder section. And when it was finished, the block was bigger than an apartment house. And that'd be solid concrete. That's what it takes to hold the Golden Gate Bridge up. Those, they called them the eye bolts that are sticking out on the left. Later on, we'll talk about that's where the cables actually attach. Now, the first thing that was built were the towers. They began with the tower on the Marin side first because it was going to be the easiest to build. And the design shows that the bridge towers were built not just for function, but also with artistic intent. Partly this is a response to the people that were concerned about the bridge was going to destroy the beauty of the Golden Gate. Well, the architects decided on the Art Deco style. If you look, it's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 big openings. Those were called portals. And you can just make out little teeny cars on the bridge deck. Below the deck where the X bracing is, that really wasn't going to be visible. It was above the deck. That's where the Art Deco detailing took place. In fact, the whole bridge was going to be sort of a showcase for then popular Art Deco styling. Many aspects of the bridge were going to get a similar treatment, like the administration building that was never built. And there's even going to be a giant Arch de Triomphe type of approach to the toll plaza. This is something that would have like warmed Mussolini's heart. Fantastic architecture. It got cut. They had a budget to meet. $35 million was what they'd raised to build the bridge. So some of these details just didn't get included. And even the architects later on said, we didn't really need it. The bridge looks better on its own. To build the first tower, the one in Marin, essentially was built on the shore of Marin County. They just built a cofferdam around the beach. So pumped the water out, and they excavated to bedrock, and they built a big concrete block. The flat areas with the bolts sticking out, that's the imprint of where the towers are going to be located. Everything was planed to less than 1/32 of an inch flat. And when the bridge towers arrived, they were built prefab on the East Coast in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And the sections were raised into place by traveling cranes or derricks that slowly made their way up the tower legs as the sections were slipped into position. That was a big realization to me. I thought that they were slapping together steel plates from the get-go. No, big sections of it were prefabricated, put on ships, came through the Panama Canal, offloaded in Oakland, and brought to the site either by rail train or by barge. A section of one of the bridge towers being slung into place. The bridge towers are hollow. They can actually move quite a bit in an earthquake or in a high wind, about 7 feet from side to side. And the interior, although it was partly riveted together, they still had to do the final riveting. So riveters working from the inside of the tower, what were called the cells, and from the outside, riveted the plates together. If you don't know what riveting is, in this series, you have 2 sheets of metal, and you stick a red hot piece of metal, the diameter of the hole, through the opening in the 2 steel plates. And while it's red hot, it's still malleable. You can form it. So you use what's called a rivet gun, pneumatically powered, to smash down the head of the rivet. And when the rivet gun is pulled away and the head cools, the whole rivet cools, and it shrinks ever so slightly, and it pulls the 2 pieces incredibly tight together. 600,000 rivets in each tower had to be hand drilled like this. The first tower, the Marin Tower, it was finished in 15 months. May of 1934. Now, in this picture here, the very top, see the traveling cranes? They're about to dismantle themselves and lower themselves down to the ground, where they'll be brought by barge to the San Francisco side, where they'll be reassembled and they're going to build the next tower. At this point, they're thinking about, well, as the metal goes up, we've got to paint it. What color is the bridge going to be? There were some designers said, well, bridges, a lot of them are being painted aluminum silver. Yeah, how about we paint it silver? Other folks said, no, traditionally you paint them carbon black, like a railroad bridge. Irving Morrow, he looked at the metal as it was being assembled, and it came in a reddish brown primer, red lead primer, we call it today. And the color was so good looking and it worked so well with the hills and the blue skies that he said, let's just formalize that into a top coat. Let's not mess with success. And they formalized it as was called International Orange paint. That's the color of the Golden Gate Bridge. That's like primer red. I wish this photo was color. It's not. This is the panels where they experimented with different types of paints, different manufacturers, different formulas, and different colors. They erected it right below the bridge. And one of these panels was actually painted gold, kind of just for fun, because they did consider maybe pulling out details of the towers in gold paint in keeping with the Golden Gate Bridge. They couldn't get the gold to look good. They decided just easier, one solid color all the way across. Now, the Navy, as I said, had some concerns about the bridge. This was the Navy's proposal for painting the Golden Gate Bridge. Got to make sure no battleships in the fog get lost and crunch into this thing. That was the thinking. Black and yellow safety stripes. The Army had a version where it was red and white, like a giant radio tower sticking up. Luckily, neither the Army nor the Navy had final say, and International Orange was the final color for the bridge. Building the South Tower, early work began while the North Tower was still in progress in the background. This was difficult because, as I said, this tower here was going to be built in the open ocean, 1,400 feet offshore. They had to build a trestle out to the site. And then they started working on blasting the bottom of the Golden Gate flat. And the way you did that was you sent divers down, hard hat divers. They would go to the bottom and working almost blind because it's so dark down there, cold. They only had 20 minutes to work at a stretch between tide changes, or they'd be pulled off the rocks on the bottom. They would set charges. They would be then lifted to the surface, charges detonated, then they'd go down and they'd direct scoops that came down and lifted the rubble. Finally, they flattened the bottom of the Golden Gate large enough to start building a giant cofferdam. This was built, it was like, get an idea of the cranes at the top and the workmen standing up there, and even at the bottom, the little teeny, it's the size of a small football stadium. The walls were 20 feet thick. It's built in the shape of an oval. And then when it was finished, the water was pumped out and they could build the bridge tower in the dry. And that's what they did. You can see in this case, the cofferdam with walls, which are 20 feet thick. The bridge tower, the base is finally rising up. This is more of a clarified view. It was left in place, the cofferdam, the concrete fender wall, 20 feet thick. This is what protects the bridge from actually being hit by a passing ship. We have a classic example of what happened when the towers aren't well protected on the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore, which as we talk is still being demolished after a freighter ran into it. It has never happened to the Golden Gate Bridge. This particular view, time progressing, this is January 1935. The cranes are working their way up and they're building now what's called the San Francisco Tower or the South Tower. And the construction work is still continuing on land where they're finishing up the big anchor blocks on the San Francisco side. Now, who were the guys that built the bridge? And I say guys because it was strictly men. Everything I've read, I've never found any women who worked actual construction on the bridge. Clerical and support, yes, but on the steel, in the concrete, no, it was guys. And they came from all over the country because San Francisco didn't have a history of building high rises or big bridges. So the high steel workers, they came from out of state. A lot of them, yeah, Chicago, New York. Yeah, they were supposed to be from the Bay Area. And the Depression is at its height, and the bridge is going to create a lot of jobs. And these jobs are supposed to go to San Francisco Bay Area natives. And you had to be a resident for a year to get a job. Well, a lot of these guys came and they paid to get false papers showing they'd been living like in, I don't know, Burlingame or Daly City for a year, fake papers just to get hired. And what were they paid? Really good wages for the time. A iron worker made $11 a day. That's going to be about $300 a day in today's money. I think that's still far below union scale. But for the Depression, that $11 a day, that meant a lot. Common laborers, guys that were just carrying stacks of stuff around or smoothing concrete, they made about $5.50 a day, around $150 today. And it was not a closed shop. It was a non-union. And if you didn't want to go along with the program, there are plenty of other people waiting at the hiring hall who'd be happy to take your job. A couple of years earlier, New York had seen the construction of the Empire State Building. And they had learned a lot of lessons on building the Empire State Building. One thing they hadn't quite gotten a handle on yet was worker safety. See in the lower right corner there, the guys were working wearing newsboy caps and coveralls. There was no safety harnesses. Joe Strauss was not going to let safety be a second thought on the Golden Gate Bridge. He insisted on an extremely high level of safety and safety gear. It was the first job where it was mandated that everybody was going to wear a hard hat. These hard hats, they were actually layer after layer of leather, stiffened with some sort of like varnish. And because they were like hats that had been hardened, they were called hard hats. And the name stuck. Miners had used them previously, but a requirement that everybody on high iron wear them. Golden Gate Bridge was first. The respirator, they found out that the guys working riveting inside those tower cells were being overcome by lead fumes from the red lead paint primer that was burning off. The light working inside the confines of the towers where guys actually got lost. What he doesn't have on here, because he's going to be working in a cell tower, the guys who worked outside, they were required to wear skin cream to protect themselves against sunburn from sun reflecting off the San Francisco fog. And Strauss caught some flack for this, but this was a very important investment. He has spent $150,000 building a jute net underneath the bridge. This net was designed to catch guys falling off the bridge. And they did. 19 guys fell off the Golden Gate Bridge during construction, were saved by falling in the net. They called themselves the Halfway to Hell Club. A very elite group. It worked so well, like when you landed in it, like a circus trampoline net. It went, whoa, whoa. They had to tell the workers, do not jump into it for fun. It's not there for your pleasure. It's to save your life, because guys were doing it. And it also picked up anything that was dropped from above, rivet guns and sections of planking. Finally, June 1935. This was the big job, and it was done. It was building the two towers, the towers that they said just couldn't be built, especially that one closest to the camera, the South Tower. They did it. And now came the laborious part. This next part had been done before all over the world, but exceptionally long was spinning the cables that support the Golden Gate Bridge deck. They're 3 feet in diameter. They did not arrive as 3 foot in diameter steel cables. They were actually built up, as this specimen shows, of exactly 27,572 individual pencil lead sized uh, individual cables. These little guys were carried across the Golden Gate Bridge, the first pair, by boat, and then they were hoisted to the top of the towers, and then they served as the basis for trolleys or shuttles that followed the preceding cables back and forth, each time laying down another cable. They were called spinning wheels because they were spinning the Golden Gate Bridge cables. Now, they figured this would take for bloody ever because they had it took 13 minutes for each cable to cross, and 13 minutes times 27, that's going to be forever. So eventually they figured out, well, if we can put one wheel on the trolley, how about we put two? How about four? How about six? And eventually they were spinning it so fast, they were able to finish spinning the cables in only 2/3 of the time allotted. Now, the temporary wooden catwalks underneath, those were for the workers. Those were built on some of the earliest cables that were spent across. Again, walkways with safety railings, safety, safety, safety. Bridge workers at either end, they put the cables on, and then when they finished their 17-minute crossing, another crew took them off. And then when the cables were finally stretched out, they were bundled together into smaller, manageable cables. And then these smaller bundles of cables were compressed by a movable hydraulic press that squeezed them into a circular cross section of 36¼ inches exactly. And right behind this machine, after it's compressed them, they wrapped the bundles of cable tightly in an outer layer of cable, and then they were painted tight. The bridge is currently undergoing a lot of work to rehab it. I mean, it's an old structure now. And one thing the engineers were concerned about 5 years ago, they unwrapped one section of one of the heavy cables to see what's that steel like in there. You know, the bridge is rusting in many places. How are the cables doing? And the engineer that I talked to, he said when they unwrapped the test section, they said the steel was still brilliant shiny, the same way it looked when FDR was president. So they said we're fine here. They rewrapped it and they moved on to other areas that needed, more intense protection. Soldiers looking at the bridge under construction, as I mentioned, the Army owned the land on both sides of the Golden Gate. The old War Department, now Department of Defense, had to approve building the bridge, which they did grudgingly. They did demand a few things, like military vehicles could cross free. Okay, that doesn't seem so bad. Any buildings that were destroyed or had to be replaced during the construction of the Golden Gate Bridge had to be replaced, or the Army compensated. And also, too, this really frustrated the military. There had to be traffic allowed through the Army posts to get to the bridge. Well, the Army said, build a freeway, an elevated freeway to cross the Presidio of San Francisco. And that way we won't have to have traffic plugging up the streets on the Army post. An elevated freeway stretching from the Marina District to the bridge was constructed. Anyone from the Bay Area remembers the old Doyle Drive. That was a gnarly freeway, very dangerous to drive. And it has since been replaced. But in its original configuration, there were no off ramps. The Army didn't want tourists, tooling around the Presidio Army post. They just want, get to the bridge, pay your toll, cross, leave us alone. On the other side of the Golden Gate Bridge, a Highway 101 was constructed by the state of California, snaking over the hills of Fort Baker and down to Sausalito. I mentioned earlier about the Army had to be compensated for any structures that were demolished or had to be moved. Well, right in the foreground, there's a line of big concrete bunkers going back to before the Spanish-American War, harbor defense, coast artillery installations, and these were in the way. And the Army said, okay, you can demolish or bury them as you see fit. And the bridge district did build other fortifications elsewhere, but underneath the toll plaza today, well, actually this is in the 1930s, but directly below where the toll booths are, there are still a labyrinth of underground tunnels and ammunition storage magazines left from the old bunkers. Now what are they used for? Storing big barrels of international orange paint. It's where the painters hang out. This is Old Fort Point, constructed during the gold rush on the eve of the Civil War, right in the way of where the giant concrete block was going to be located for the San Francisco anchorage. Joseph Strauss did not want to demolish the fort, partly because it's its own engineering marvel for the time period, and it was historic, and also, too, they'd have to recompense the Army for the demolition and the loss of storage space. The bridge was a big warehouse, or the fort was a warehouse. So what Strauss did was they tickled the design of the bridge, and they designed a giant arch to jump over Fort Point. And it's sort of one of the identifying qualities of the Golden Gate Bridge today, the giant arch, purely to save Fort Point, which became a National Historic Site managed by my former agency, the National Park Service, in 1970. Towers were up, the cables were spun. The last part was putting up the traffic deck, the bridge deck. And like the section of the tower, these came prefab. Cranes lifted them into position from barges floating below. And these smaller diameter cables, what are called suspender ropes, those were looped over the heavy cable, and they were attached to the bridge deck. They're called suspender ropes because they actually suspend the deck from the cables. Bridge workers hauling up, riveting, bolting, good shots also of the net. And as you got to the 1936, well, the bridges, the two ends are approaching each other. They worked from both ends towards the center to spread the weight out. There were people that were opposed to the bridge in the first place. And when it got to this stage, you had people saying things like, those idiots have no idea what they're doing. Bridges aren't shaped like that. The two ends don't even meet. The engineers knew what they were doing. They knew that the tensile strength of the steel would allow it to expand as it stretched. And as more and more of the bridge deck was added, the more the big cables stretched until the two ends, when they met up at mid-span, they meshed perfectly. One account that I read said that, well, the rivet holes weren't exactly lining up. So all they did was they waited around for the day to warm up or cool down until the steel expanded and contracted. And the moment the rivet holes lined up, the bridge was essentially, it was done. Endless laying of concrete. There's enough concrete in the Golden Gate Bridge between the traffic deck and the anchorages to build a 10-foot sidewalk from San Francisco to New York City. Bridge District built its own concrete batching plant, fleets of cement mixers. And sometime in early 1937, they started to pull down all the scaffolding and all the cranes, and the bridge started to reveal itself. And people were, especially in San Francisco, they were amazed. They were impressed, the old term gobsmacked, by how beautiful it was. They'd seen the pictures, but to actually see it, it was decided, we got to have a party. And they decided to celebrate at the end of May 1937 by having a grand carnival in San Francisco called the Old West Days. And parts of the city were turned into false front saloons and bars and boutiques, and people dressed up as cowboys and wore, I guess we now call it to be culturally insensitive clothing like Spanish caballeros. And a date was set, May 28th, when traffic was going to be allowed across the bridge. That was going to be the great opening. And I don't know who came up with the idea. They said, let's let the public have a day on the bridge before it's open to traffic. They'll never have this opportunity to see it again. They declared the day before, May 27th, to be Bridge Pedestrian Day. And 200,000 people showed up. They uh, packed the sidewalks. They looked over the sides. They ate hot dogs. They got in. They had heart attacks. It was everything a giant special event would be, and it really stayed with everybody who was there. My mom walked across the bridge that day. Um, that was the one opportunity to get up close and personal with the Golden Gate Bridge. And people did wacky things. Uh, they thought there were going to be prizes. There weren't. Um, there was who was the first person to walk across the bridge? Who was the first person to walk on stilts? Who was going to be the first person to cross in roller skates? Uh, the paramedics were called at one point because there was a woman who was staggering across the bridge, with her mouth open and her tongue hanging out. And she thought she was going to get a prize for being the first person to cross the bridge, sticking her tongue out. No, it didn't work. People wore costumes. It was a real San Francisco event. And that night, the bridge workers had to come back because there was a mountain of trash and people had scratched their names into the paint of the Golden Gate Bridge. They had to give it a quick touch up because the next day all the dignitaries were going to show up. You had the mayor, you had the governor, you had the secretary of war. They crossed in a motorcade from Marin heading south. And when they got to the toll plaza, the last ribbon, it was actually, these were young women who had been contestants to be the Fiesta Queen for the Old West days. And at right center, see, there's a little guy. He's shorter than any of the women. At a microphone, that's Joe Strauss. That's the chief engineer of the Golden Gate Bridge. And he's reading a terrible poem that he wrote called "At Last the Mighty Deed is Done." And he made some comments afterwards, and one of which stuck with me is, to paraphrase him, he said that before he was the bridge that couldn't be built on rock that would never support its weight, of money that could never be raised. He said that if the bridge was covered with cars, bumper to bumper, loaded with passengers, and if the walkways were full of pedestrians, shoulder to shoulder, and if a hurricane should hit, and if at that moment a giant with a giant hacksaw should cut both of the bridge cables in half, the bridge will stand. And he was right. The Golden Gate Bridge is so over designed that it stood up to earthquakes, and a memorable recreation of Pedestrian Day we'll talk about in a second. At noon, FDR pushed a button in Washington, D.C. at the White House, and the bridge opened for traffic. This is the first contingent of cars to cross. Everybody wanted to drive across the Golden Gate Bridge when it was first opened. And then once the newness was over, traffic was pretty scarce. Later reports in 1937, 1938, 1939, the bridge wasn't even making enough to pay the interest on the bonds. They actually lost money the first few years. It's still the depths of the Depression, and it was not cheap to cross the Golden Gate Bridge. It doesn't sound like much to say it cost a quarter each way and a nickel per passenger. Translate that into 2024 money, and it's over $20 to cross the bridge. So people might cross once, maybe go to Muir Woods or just have the experience. It really wasn't until World War II, with the shipyards that were built in Marin County and war work and workers crossing and cargo coming across the Golden Gate Bridge, it really started to turn around. The ferries finally gave up the ghost in 1941, and then the bridge had exclusive of traffic crossing the Golden Gate. When World War II broke out, the feeling was still the bridge could be a target because it was becoming an icon, and because it was recognized, although nearly impossible to do, that it could be damaged and maybe plug the harbor. More likely, if it was damaged, traffic wouldn't be able to cross, and it'd cripple commerce. So the National Guard began patrolling it. Now, when I started working for the Park Service and I saw this photo, I thought, this is hilarious. Like, they're going to stop a Japanese attack with their 03 Springfields. Well, after 9/11, the National Guard returned, not fearing Japanese saboteurs, but fearing terrorist attack. They stayed for many, many months, and they were replaced by a very sophisticated surveillance system that now exists, monitoring all pedestrians and all vehicles crossing the bridge. World War II saw so many soldiers, sailors, and Marines sailing under the Golden Gate Bridge that it became really impressed into the national consciousness, partly because it was so large, it was the last thing departing service people saw when they left San Francisco. And if they survived the war, it was the first thing they saw rising up over the horizon as they came back to California. And the bridge also became iconic in movies. And it has been, for some reason, Hollywood is fascinated with how do you destroy the Golden Gate Bridge? And in 1955, it was a giant octopus. In the movie, it came from beneath the sea. I was a film student, and we were always impressed by the artistry to create this giant octopus, but it was so hard to animate him. The octopus, if you looked closely, it only had 6 legs instead of 8. But hey, after the Golden Gate Bridge, it went on to destroy the ferry building. And then get to the 2000s, Godzilla simply walked through the Golden Gate Bridge. He must have been mighty tall to have reached that high when he's walking in water 350 feet deep, but it's Hollywood. And then my favorite is when it was taken over by really irate primates and the original Rise of the Planet of the Apes in 2011. It appears another way in Hollywood movies. This is a Starfleet Command. If anyone out there is a Trekker, or sometimes we call them Trekkies, Starfleet Command headquarters, the 2260 future version of West Point, or the Air Force Academy, is located in Fort Baker on the north side of the Golden Gate Bridge. As they got close to the 50th anniversary of the bridge in 1985, or rather 1987, it was thought, we got to have a celebration to celebrate the 50th years of the Golden Gate Bridge. How about recreating Pedestrian Day? Remember how much fun everybody had in this 1937 view of all the people walking on the Golden Gate Bridge, having a great time? And it almost didn't happen because the bridge is so critical now that it was pointed out, gosh, what if we need to get an ambulance across the Golden Gate Bridge? What if there's a fire? Can we actually close the Golden Gate Bridge to traffic? And experts, love it, were brought in who said, if you close it from 7 to 10 a.m. on a quiet Sunday morning, maybe you'll get 90,000 people. And yeah, you can do it. And if an ambulance has to cross, you just escort them through the crowd. Well, they underestimated. It wasn't 90,000 people. They got 300,000. I was working that day, and in this aerial view, the picture on left, I'm somewhere down near that round building at the toll plaza. We had no idea how bad this was. We could only see a sea of people ahead of us. It was only from airplanes, and later on, still photos, we realized how bad. There were about 800,000 people that tried to get onto the bridge. 300,000 made it. 500,000 were stuck in the approaches on the Golden Gate Bridge, Doyle Drive, and in Marin County. Up close, people couldn't move. Luckily, everybody was in good spirits. But watching from the sides, we noticed something that was pretty chilling. In this telephoto view, if you look right in the middle of the photograph, you can see the bridge went flat. That's not supposed to happen. There were so many people on the bridge, they were stressing it. The bridge engineers were watching going, we got to get people off of the bridge. Life safety people were watching going, we got to get people off the bridge. Finally, after noon, they were able to clear the bridge, and they had a pseudo recreation of the first crossing of the first autocade. And then they went and they crunched the numbers, and they realized the bridge was in no danger of being damaged at all. It would have taken essentially this number of people doubled standing on each other's shoulders to have gotten to the any failure limit, but still it was such an unexpected experience that they never recreated Bridge Walk. We'll never see it happen again. When the time came for the 75th anniversary, they had a heck of a fireworks show, but no pedestrians were allowed on the bridge the entire day. Uh, Everything was, from a distance, enjoy, don't touch. And then when the 85th anniversary came, all they did, they set up a website. They didn't even have any special events. I think they're very afraid of a recreation. The bridge is aging. The parts of it that have shown the most problem are the cantilevered approaches, both in Marin and on San Francisco. And they did an in-depth survey back in 2018 of the bridge itself. Now, they knew that the approaches had to be repaired. In fact, they'd been being repaired for about 20 years. When this picture was taken, this was the first time that they really got up close and personal. They did what's called arm's length inspection of the towers. And they looked at all the rivets, and they looked at, as I mentioned, the unwrapped part of the cable. They found that the bridge is in what they qualified as good condition, which doesn't sound like maybe like you're damning with faint praise, but the only bridges that get excellent are like brand new. The Golden Gate Bridge had time on it, and the towers need to be repainted. There are some areas of severe rust they want to address, but those can be handled. The overall project of repairing the approaches to the bridge, doing seismic upgrades to the bridge, it had been going on since the mid 2000s. And by the time it's done, hopefully within the next 2 years, it's a $1.3 billion project. And remember, it only cost $35 million to build it in the first place. $1.2 billion. Hopefully, it'll last until Star Trek. That's the idea. And another big project going on is on the macabre side, is the bridge is attractive to people that want to end their lives. So they're just wrapping up installing a suicide net underneath the Golden Gate Bridge. This isn't like the net with all the springiness in it when the bridge was constructed. This is rigid cyclone fencing coated in plastic. So if anyone jumps off the bridge, they're going to go maybe 20, 25 feet down, land on this, and it's unforgiving, but they'll survive until we can get them the help that they need. Idea being that probably no one who wants to commit suicide wants to go through the bone-crushing experience of landing in that net and then trying to climb to the edge and take another drop. Numbers are still early, but it seems to be having an effect. Suicide numbers are down on the bridge. So the bridge, it's an icon, and to me, it's timeless. There have been changes to it. They've changed what the lights look like. They've put the suicide barrier up. The bridge approaches are being, but compare the bridge to 1937 to today, it continues. It's been part of generations of San Franciscans' lives. I tell people, if you're not from San Francisco, be sure to walk across the Golden Gate Bridge. If you're from San Francisco and you haven't, do it. Walk across the bridge. It's ours. It's our home. And the bridge also talks. It used to have the suspender cables vibrate in the high wind. That was sort of pleasant. They have found out that some of the rebuilds they've done to the bridge railing cause it to hum in a totally different sound spectrum. And they're working on correcting that because that's keeping people up at night. The bridge is very much alive. I'm pleased to say that I visit it every chance I can, either as a commuter or just being a darn tourist in my own backyard. So that wraps up my story. Thank you for coming, and I want to thank these people that helped me put together this story. And I will turn it back over to you guys.
Great, John. The slides were spectacular, and I think you already handled some of the questions that we had come in. People wanted to know about the safety aspects of the construction, and I think you handled that in some really good detail. You mentioned the Art Deco look of the bridge, and there were a couple of projects, the admin building and the Arc de Triomphe that didn't get built. Were
Right.
there any other structures that or features that were thought about to go on the bridge and then decided against?
Yeah, there were three. Uh, the first one was for safety. If you walk across the Golden Gate Bridge, every so often there's a little pop out in the bridge railing. It was a recess where they were supposed to install benches for pedestrians to sit.
Mhm.
And it was afraid, even back then, that might be too convenient for people to use that as a first step up to get to the railing and then go over the side. So those were left out. There was supposed to be dramatic up-looking lighting on each of the bridge towers. That wasn't implemented originally because of cost. It's a feature, though, that was actually completed for the 1987 50th. So it was envisioned and it was briefly illuminated during the celebrations when the bridge was first finished. But then it was dark for 50 years, but now it's lit up at night. The last one, my favorite, is they left the option open to build a restaurant at the top of the North Tower of the Golden Gate Bridge. I have no idea what the capacity would have been. There is a teeny tiny elevator used by workmen that goes to the top of the tower. But during construction in 1933, the tower was just about finished and an earthquake hit. And it was moving so much that even the high iron workers were sick to their stomach. So they left out that detail also.
Good idea. And I'm also glad that the Navy and the Army didn't have their way with the paint.
Right, right.
Yeah, imagine what that would look like. On the East Coast, and I think a lot of places, pedestrian traffic, vehicle traffic, but then they also open up the bridge for rail service.
Right.
That ever considered for Golden Gate?
It was. Joseph Strauss so over designed the bridge that initially it would have been possible to have had rail running on a lower deck that was never constructed. Almost as soon as the bridge was finished, they started to alter it in various ways. They started to hang extra utilities on that unfinished lower deck. After a heavy wind in the 1950s, they put additional steel strengthening, so much that by the time that BART was being designed in the 1960s, Marin County, which elected not to be part of BART, when they looked at the bridge, so much weight had been added, it couldn't have handled the trains. Yeah, and just as well.
Yeah. Speaking of weight, we did have a couple people who wrote in that they were part of the 50th.
Yeah.
Crowd on the bridge. I was actually on the Jeremiah O'Brien going underneath the bridge. And of course, we couldn't see how many people were on the deck. We could only see who was along the railings. But we noticed the flattening out of the bridge. In fact, everybody was pointing it out that the bridge had assumed a different aspect.
I was when I knew things must be really bad out there. Was I had a video camera with the telephoto lens. You could see people climbing over the railings. Some of them with their bicycles, walking along the there's a little narrow shelf that the workers use. They were trying to flee the scene of what they thought was going to be a catastrophe.
Jeez. From looking at it, it was scary. But as you said, the Golden Gate is amazingly overbuilt.
Right. Good. So,
and I think that's it for questions, John. This was a lot of fun, and your slides were great. And it was you obviously know, as I said earlier, what it is that you speak of. So, thank you for doing this for us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
And I'd like to thank everybody for viewing this morning. If you missed any of our earlier programs, you can find them by visiting the museum website at museumsrv.org. John's program will appear early next week. The virtual program is going on vacation, It does not go live during the month of the museum's fundraiser. And so our summer soiree is scheduled for June the 22nd. If you haven't been out to do this, it's held at our 1891 Tassajara Grammar School. It's an elegant dinner on the grounds of the school, music, games, lots of fun. We're going to hope that it's not 110, but no guarantees on that. Also, the museum's annual event, our beer crawl through downtown Danville, Shops and Hops, is scheduled for next Thursday, 6 to 9. And you can get tickets for both the summer soiree and Shops and Hops by visiting the museum website. Our next virtual program will be on Thursday, July the 18th, when we explore the geology of Mount Diablo. If you like these programs and want them to continue, we ask that you make a donation by going to the museum's homepage. That's museumsrv.org again, and clicking on the Donate Now button. We're also in need of volunteers at the museum. If you can give us some time, please contact us. John, thank you once again. I hope everybody enjoyed today's presentation. Stay safe, and thanks for watching. Bye-bye.
Bye all.